Hello there and Happy New Year. Holding the microphone a little bit strange because I've actually lost my normal microphone and I'm having to use my headset as a substitute. Power and politics. I'm sure most of you are actually thinking more about surviving the next few weeks and getting into the exam, which for those of you who are a bit diligent on Moodle, you'll have noticed that it's been announced for the 2nd of February, which is very much the beginning of the exam period, which makes it a little bit tough on you in terms of preparing. Now, in the next few days on the Moodle website, I'll be giving as much away as I'm legally allowed to in relation to the content of the exam. And so keep a good eye on Moodle and your emails in the next few days as I update. I'm sorry I'm also a day late with this. I've been doing a lot of marking and I'm just about up to date myself. I hope that for those of you who aren't being marked by me directly, that you're getting your feedback on reasonable time as well. Okay, let's get into the topic for the week, power and politics. So I won't bother with the definitions, but power is the capacity that Agent A has to influence Agent B so that B acts in accordance with A's wishes. And of course, A and B could be either an organization or a team, and so on. You know, you can have a team of managers trying to influence a team of employees or a group. Its power exists as a potential. It doesn't have to actually be actualized. It can exist as a potential in a person. A person can simply have power, but not use that power. And power depends on dependency. And dependency relates to where that B, which is the person or the group that is being ruled, has or needs something that A possesses and that B requires. So in order for power to have some kind of traction, the leader has to have some kind of hold over the person that's led. So it depends on that dependency relationship. And the greater that your dependency, the more power you give to the person above you. So as an employee, you can actually reduce the power that anyone has over you by giving yourself, for example, options. If you're an employee, if you have a side business, you are less dependent upon your employer. Or if you've developed skills by going to uni, for example, and have become much more keenly sought for in the market from headhunters, for example, then you have reduced your dependency and reduced the power your boss has over you without any other characteristic of your boss changing, for example. So power requires dependency. It requires the dependency of followers, and it is used to influence on those at your level. And you can also use it upward power to gain power over yourself, whereas leadership is this characteristic used to influence those below you. And it requires some kind of goal compatibility with followers. If the team is being led by a person who's focused solely on their own personal gain, they will struggle to be able to achieve much with their leadership if they don't have some kind of synchronicity between what they as a leader want and what the organization wants and what the employers want. And you need to work to align those forces. Okay, now we often talk in organizational terms, particularly mature organizations, about formal power. But when organizations such as companies begin, they usually are, just mum and dad operations, for example, a fruit and veggie shop, for example, with maybe one employee or two employees. And most businesses start this way. Very few businesses start life fully formed. It is possible. With, for example, if you raise a lot of money on the stock market, you can suddenly create a whole company, a whole substantial company. But more commonly, companies start informal and then mature into formality. And companies will find themselves in a position where they really need rules and policies in place in order to govern staff effectively. As an employer myself, That's how it went with me. I started incredibly informal. Everybody who had a problem just came direct to me, and I solved it ad hoc, person by person case. As the business grew, I actually enjoyed that stage where I was able to hand off responsibility to rules. So it didn't become as personal as a form of management, but that can be a good thing when you're in trouble. So if you've got something nasty to do with staff, if you can refer to a policy, some sort of third-party policy, as opposed to, well, I don't like that you do this, I don't want you to do it, it's not as easy a message to get across as, look, the workplace health and safety policy of the company requires, blah, blah, blah. Now, three different types of, I can see my picture as obscuring parts of the slides. I'll just shift it, but you can have three different kinds of power: coercive, reward power, legitimate power. This policy and rules often relates to legitimate power. People can be really boring, dull little individuals, but still have a lot of power because it's invested in them through the rules and policies of an organization. And legitimate power can also come about through convention, not just written down rules. So the supervisor in an organization is understood, even if it's not written down, as to have some right to tell you what to do. Reward power is, incentives, and coercive power is bossiness, so to speak. Personal power often arises from force of personality, force of character of an individual. This is the old style of leadership, which we'll talk about. But personal power can be two kinds. And the old style is this referent: charisma, influence, strength, likability, force of character again. Expert power can relate to that nerdy power, the power that comes from knowledge, or the example that I think I've given before, but I think it's a particularly good one, is he who controls the photocopier in the office, or she who controls the photocopier, or he or she who is able to repair the photocopier suddenly becomes powerful through their knowledge. And that's a form of personal power. Now we talked about this dependency and how that creates power. The greater dependency you have, there's three keys to increasing dependency. If you have something that is important, scarce, and non-fungible, fungible is an economics term to do with replaceability of things. So if you have a skill that is important, scarce, and difficult to replace, then you are in a greater power position and people are more dependent on you. How to increase grip on power? And let's talk about 9 different influence tactics of getting what you want. Now, legitimacy. I won't show those videos. Legitimacy is this kind of the power that arises from rules and regulations, the fact that you have a right to be powerful in your organization. Rational persuasion, kind of obvious. Inspirational appeals relates very much to that transformational leadership, charisma leadership. Consultation is that consultative servant leadership that we either have or will talk about. Exchange is related to rewards. Personal appeals is related to, closely related to ingratiation, but relates to that personal ability to simply ask for something. Ingratiate is how you flattery and making people feel good. Pressure is kind of like the authoritative, assertive style of influence, and the politics involved with running coalitions. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Inspirational and pressure are the best methods of influencing those beneath you. Well, these group of 3, and pressure are the best means of influencing those beneath you. And these 3, legitimacy, coalitions, and exchange, are the best for influencing those around you, according to the literature. Rational appeals, best for influencing those above you, and they tend to be the best all round. However, sometimes rational persuasion doesn't work. Sometimes things aren't very amenable to rational persuasion. You simply, for example, if you are in a position where your boss has ordered you to do X, Y, and Z, um, and it doesn't make any sense to you, you will not be able to rely on rational persuasion in order to achieve what you want to do. You will simply have to rely on legitimacy and pressure to get across what you want. I think I've got some of these elements slightly wrong, but you can actually pause the YouTube clip and have a look at how I assembled those arguments. I did this during the Christmas break actually, and am fairly. It seems like years ago Christmas, but it's only a matter of a couple of weeks. So how do you use power effectively? It tends to depend on some contingencies, including your political skill, the sequence in which you use your tactics, and organizational culture. I'll just briefly touch on this one, which may seem a little bit unusual. So sequence. Let's say you go in hard early, and you just use authority and legitimate power to achieve what you want to achieve. If that doesn't work, what do you do then? You've used the maximum power setting you can in terms of influence. You can't suddenly go back to ingratiation. It just doesn't sit well with employees or those beneath you or those above you. So it's best to start gently and then ramp it up. The other ones are relatively more logical. Just want to say a few words about sexual harassment, which is increasingly a key issue within the Australian workplace, and it is a broad problem. It doesn't simply involve groping, for example, but it also can use language, inappropriate use of sharing of emails, anything that is inappropriate in a sexual nature, and it's quite a broad definition. It's not just something that can occur from top to the bottom. Your boss is sexually harassing staff. That power differential encourages that. It can also be upward harassment, where, and it's not just men against women. It's not unknown for women to sexually harass guys, and there's been some fairly famous cases of that. Remember that sexual harassment isn't really about sex or sexiness, and the reason the whole power issue is so key here is that very often it is about power, just as rape, through extensive studies of rapists, it's been pretty well established that rape is really an exerting of power over a weaker individual or a person that you force to be weaker. Very ugly phenomenon, but this is why there are all sorts of restrictions within workplace policy about workplace relationships, and the textbook covers this quite well. But the point that needs to be emphasized here is that the reason that they have these regulations in place is that it's very hard to be completely free to say yes or no, to give consent, so to speak, to sexual relations or any kind of sexualized contact if you're in a weaker organizational position. So there's very strict rules in organizations, from universities to companies, about sexual relations between of any kind between supervising staff, even consensual, so-called consensual, because how much can you really consent when your job depends on it? So power is really a key issue in deciding sexual harassment. And it can include all sorts of stuff. Just beware. There's rules in place, particularly with emails, sharing of jokes, and there's all sorts of stuff that's happening out there that you do need to be aware of. It's not just about men, but what you can do as a manager to deal with sexual harassment, or you need to cover your back, so to speak. So if you're a HR manager, listen up, this is important. You need to have the policy background in place. If you can demonstrate to when an incident happens, it's more likely in a large company when it happens rather than if it happens, it will happen. You can come under legal threat as an organization, and the organization can be responsible for sexual harassment that occurs in the workplace, even though it's a personal event to some degree. It is an organizational responsibility. You need to reduce the organizational risk by having policies in place. When an incident occurs, you have to investigate. You have to provide the complainant some kind of protection against further offending, otherwise you're in deep trouble. You also need to, punish perpetrators if you find them out, and through all sorts of means. You can punish them by sacking them, you can punish them by shifting them to a different division, demoting or something like that. But you also need to introduce remedial training, and also proactive training in the workplace is a good way to deal with this risk in the workplace. And believe me, it's a risk. You spend so much time together under all sorts of pressure conditions with employees. And I don't think I've mentioned in one of my previous lectures how, there is plenty of evidence from the literature on love and romance and sex that demonstrates that, and emotions, that demonstrates you can create a sense of romance simply by putting people under pressure in the same environment for an extended period of time. It has a kind of romantic or sexy feel to it that can get out of hand. And with all these power differentials and organizational structures in place, risky territory, the whole lot. Okay, let's have a chat about politics. We're not talking about the party politics, and we're facing an election here in Queensland, and no doubt we'll be facing one nationally within the year or two. It's all going to be very interesting, but we're not talking about that. Politics is generally an unlikable thing unless you're a politician. So within politics itself, party politics, it's essential. Political behaviour is essential. Within organisations, it's non-ideal. So we will be talking about how to reduce politics within organisations, because it very rarely is a good thing. It's also one of those things that can't be eliminated, a bit like germs from the human body. You can scrub and deodorize and disinfect, but you'll never get rid of germs, and you'll never get rid of politics either. It includes those activities that are required as part of the formal role in an organisation, but it tries to or succeeds at influencing the distribution of resources or power within the organisation. There's all sorts of political plays. First of all, let's have a look at the power tools. So you can leak gossip or whistleblow. Remember, gossip is another one of these unavoidables. And gossip and whistleblowing can all have very powerful and positive roles within an organisation, but they can also have political roles where it's for personal gain rather than for the organisational benefit. You can use form alliances, join coalitions, not just in politics, but in the world of business as well. You can withhold key information or give information. You can exchange favours. I'll rub your back, you rub mine. I'll scratch your back, I'll scratch mine. Lobbying, which is kind of like that personal persuasiveness that you can do within an organisation, which is kind of probably the best of the political things, but it's still, if it's for personal gain, that's the differentiation of politics versus OCB behaviours, where you're doing it for the gain of the organisation. Some of the techniques can include, excuse me, my eyes itching. I've used the colloquial terms, but I'll also use slightly more formal terms: blaming others, ascribing responsibility. It was his fault. Sucking up, develop working relationships is the much more polite version of saying that. Buck passing, delegating. This is a common, and in fact the ability to delegate is an extremely good skill to have within organisations, but it's not terribly taking responsibility, is it? Covering your backside is documenting decisions. So a common modern phenomenon here is sending an email. So let's say you've got going back to the sexual harassment, let's say you've got a staff member who has been naughty, has got a bit of a persistent habit of making off-colour jokes within the organisation. You just send him a quick email: Bob, don't do that, and you've covered your back. You haven't really done anything. You haven't gone out and sat Bob down and given a hard talking to or put him into a training, but you've covered your back. You've documented that you did something, even though you really did nothing. Very common political manoeuvre. And you'll find all sorts of interesting emails bouncing around in organisations that are purely about documenting, not about doing it all. Opportunism, taking advantage of accidents, disasters, or pieces of good fortune and personally ascribing them to yourself, or taking hold of the opportunities offered. And apple polishing, which is kind of like exaggerating, demonstrating loyalty is what I've written there, but it's also about exaggerating your role within a particular achievement. It's almost an inevitable consequence of limited resources, ambiguous information. So you can actually start to reduce politics. You can't deal with the limited resources, but you can certainly deal with the ambiguous information. So the example I gave in class yesterday was, I thought, quite a good one. So imagine if you have a senior HR manager who's getting to the point of retirement, okay, and you've got 5 deputy HR managers who are all jockeying for position. Dangerous territory where that's limited resources, and you can deal with that. You can't change the limited resource. There's only going to be one new HR manager, but you can deal with the ambiguous information. For example, you can clearly state months in advance of the retirement announcement, or months in advance of the retirement moment, so-and-so is going to resign. We're going to get an independent committee set up to appoint the successor. It's going to take place at the such and such hotel. You'll all be encouraged to apply. The decision will be at arm's length to the organisation, and there will be a union representative. Make it all nice and clear what's going to happen. And you will drastically reduce politics in this kind of setting. Excuse me. It's an overall model talking about the different components within political behaviour. So you get these individual factors, and that can relate to people who are high self-monitors, for example. It's a nice one. High self-monitors tend to be better at politics. They're the ones who, like I've been doing today, is grooming my hair, making sure that I use the right hand movements, that kind of thing. High self-monitors are a great example, really, is these new selfie sticks that you can get now for your phone, which enable you to actually look at yourself from a distance. Think of a high self-monitor as someone who's got a selfie taking place at all times. So they're keeping very, very conscious of how they're pouting their lips and smiling and holding their head and how they're speaking, etc. These are the high self-monitor attributes. Organizational factors, we talked about issues of low trust, and we talked about low ambiguity, role ambiguity, for example. These factors are some of the factors. I'll just zoom in there. These factors are some of the factors that can improve or increase political behaviours. And the political behaviours are aimed at outcomes such as gaining rewards from the organisation or reverting getting sacked, for example, when things are going badly. People tend to respond to politics with a number of different ways, none of which are particularly good. Lower job satisfaction, increased anxiety, increased staff turnover, and reduced performance. Politics can become the outcome that starts to happen in organisations. It can become the product that you produce, and that's a very negative outcome for the organisation. People can simply be focused on not doing good, but looking good, making themselves seem that they're doing good rather than actually doing good. And this is a high politics organisation can fall into this trap. So we've got this issue of impression management, and it's worth saying that impression management is an effective technique, but as a manager you need to be careful that you're not promoting people who are actually just very good at impression management and not particularly good at producing the product or service that your company is focused on. I'm trying to get this to move and it is not moving. Okay, so I think I've got slightly the wrong version of it. Some of the techniques of impression management that you can do, and I've got a few of these listed up here, but the text talks about them in greater extent. But for example, you can make excuses. Sorry, I wasn't there. You can make apologies. The Peter Beattie effect, I like to call this, after the Queensland Premier, who was famous for saying sorry for even things that he wasn't sorry for, or he wasn't even responsible for. And you can use flattery. Gee, you're looking great in that dress. Enhancement. We've got a 0.001% increase in sales this month. Look, that's the 4th month. We've got an increase in sales, but who gives a damn about a 0.01% increase in sales? It's not significant, but you can make it sound significant. I've mentioned flattery twice there. That means I'm missing one from the textbook, so please do look it up. Self-promotion, which is kind of like a version of impression management in itself, but it's about lobbying and saying how great am I, and of course conformity, fitting in. And that's it for the week. A relatively quick one. Interesting topic, and I sort of urge you to develop some skills in politics, but beware of it in others. And, as we'll probably talk about or probably did talk about in a previous lecture on leadership, there is increasing evidence now that integrity in leaders, integrity in managers, is becoming one of the most effective characteristics of a successful manager. Contrast with what we mentioned in the very first lecture, I believe, which was about managers who get promoted, not successful, who get promoted, tend to be the ones who are the best networkers, so the best at politics. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there's evidence from talking to a lot of lower level staff is the most effective form of management, which is the kind of management that you want in order for the company to make a profit and the company to do well, not you to do well, are ones with integrity. And integrity tends to not be very compatible with the kind of politics we're talking about here. Anyway, interesting topic, and we'll see you next week. Also, I am going to put out those in the next few days, the exam advice. So thanks very much for listening, and keep an eye on Moodle and keep an eye on your emails. Happy New Year again.